Well, morning everybody. Welcome to Dorset Healthcare on this glorious day. I think we can safely say 2020 has been like no other in living memory. New normals, lockdowns, social distancing. However, this has really captured a wave of hope and created a bit of a catalyst, I think, to take the people positives and move them into things such as Thursday night claps, Captain Tom's amazing fundraiser, and an overall mandate for better health and well-being and a sustainable focused future. A Green Swan-led recovery gives us a chance to reset and take stock. People have taken exercise for the first time with maybe unintended consequences of crazy traffic hotspots in Durdle Door and Dorset Beaches and Snowdonia, but people have got out there. Dorset Healthcare with our other trusts are working hard to reduce carbon. The local authorities have declared a climate emergency, and we're all trying to do our piece. NHS has been the first national health system to commit to net zero carbon, carbon net zero even, and we know that air pollution is linked to health conditions such as heart disease, stroke and asthma. The NHS is the biggest single health system in the world, Britain's biggest employer, and creates 4% of the nation's carbon, and it's committed to being carbon neutral by 2040, which is a real ambitious thing to do. Today we're thrilled to welcome Bruce Dainsley, a best-selling author and technology leader from the UK. Spent 8 years as a VP at Twitter, having joined the company in 2012. Bruce frequently speaks about the importance of laughter in the workplace. He highlights the benefits of reducing the interruptions of emails, yes please, the importance of striking the right work-life balance, and a contribution which digital social media is making to our lives. Bruce highlighted the importance for improving work culture in his book, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, and it's a compelling manifesto for an era overwhelmed with work pressures. Bruce grew up in a council estate in Birmingham and started his life working in a fast food restaurant to help him pay his way to become the first member of his family to go to university. And after loads of rejections, Bruce landed his first career role by taking a risk and drawing a cartoon CV of his life. 20 years on, he's having worked for radio and magazines. He's made his way into technology firms like YouTube, Google and Twitter. Ladies and gentlemen, please say hello to Bruce Dainsley.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. You got the long version of my bio there. Yeah, I'm so thrilled to be here. And myself and Sally started talking about work culture stuff. Actually, I sort of do a podcast and a newsletter about anyone trying to improve their working culture and get back to enjoying their job. And actually, it was from that newsletter where I posted a couple of months ago, really, that I was looking to see if companies and organizations were interested in a presentation on climate change. So to give you a slight bit of background, I've always had a keen interest in climate change and campaigning on it. And I guess my own personal frustration is that what we do see increasingly people like David Attenborough coming out and talking about these things, we often find that they're fringe, they're regarded as sort of fringe conversations. We don't necessarily see a lot of mainstream conversations. I myself chose to apply to join the organization that's been put together by the former Vice President Al Gore. And you might remember Al Gore. He literally coming up in 2 weeks' time, 20 years ago, Al Gore found himself in the presidential election against George W. Bush, and it came to a decision that was decided in the Supreme Court who was going to become president. On a 5-4 verdict, George W. Bush won the state of Florida. You might remember it was contested ballots. The question of whether some of the ballot slips had been fully punched through or not. And as a result of losing that election, I think Vice President Gore decided that he wasn't going to allow schisms to divide the country. He accepted the result, and he then spent the time since really trying to draw attention to the challenges of climate change. So you might have seen his film in 2005, An Inconvenient Truth. and he's gone on really to develop that. So I found myself applying for his Climate Reality group. One of the things that Climate Reality say is that anyone can apply, but one of the criteria is that you will spread the word. And so it's a really inspiring organization. I was trained by the Vice President this summer, and it's mind-blowing, actually. There's some wonderful women in Latin America whose whole livelihoods are being challenged by farmers, aggressive farmers there, and yet they've joined this movement to spread the word. Or these just really inspiring people in Southeast Asia whose livelihoods are being swept away by rising waters, rising tides, and their agricultural land has been damaged, and yet they're organizing and they're creating movement, and it's a global movement. One of the things you commit to is try and get the message out there. So in the course of the next 2 or 3 weeks, I'm presenting to about 2,000 people in little sessions like this, spreading the word. So that's what I'm going to do for you today. I'm going to really sort of give you a perspective where we are with climate change. I think a lot of us see news items, but we don't always get the opportunity to delve into exactly where the situation is right now. And I guess the way it's evolved in the time since Al Gore started telling the story is that effectively when he started his journey, there was no real solutions. We hoped that into the space we were looking, solutions would come about. And actually 15 years on, that's really changed. And for the first time, we can see clear solutions to the problems we're facing, but we need to get a degree more urgency. So that's what I'm going to do for you today. I'm going to give you a perspective. I'm going to take you through some of the stuff that Al Gore talks about, and I'm going to give you very direct ways that any of us can be thinking about how we can solve this and we can reduce our own contribution. So I'm going to sort of whiz through and give you a perspective of all of those things. So let me kick off. One of the first things that the former Vice President often talks about is this image here. So this image here is called, it's sometimes called the blue marble. It was a photograph taken by some of the astronauts returning one of the Apollo missions in 1972, and they found themselves flying back from the moon, and one of them grabbed a camera, literally shone it, poked it out the window towards the window, and took this photograph. And it was the first time that anyone had captured the whole of the Earth. There are a few other photographs from the Apollo missions where the Earth is partly shrouded in the shadows of the moon, but this was the first time the whole Earth was photographed. And to some extent, it's a nice little metaphor then for this sphere that we find ourselves on and the climate that we need to deal with. You can see here that you can see the Horn of Africa down to the Antarctic. And I'm going to talk a little bit about man's impact on that ecosystem and what we can do. So the structure that the former Vice President goes through, he goes through this idea of must we change, can we change, and will we change? The first part is about 10-15 minutes, and it's an attritional warfare. I'm going to give you a full summary of exactly how bad things have got. So let me delve into this. I find that as we get into some of the stuff later on, there's real grounds for optimism, but I'm going to give you the bleak information as we stand right now. So firstly, must we change? Well, when I showed you that sphere, it's slightly an illusion, because actually when you get close, so we might see that whole planet, but of course we only occupy a really small part of that. The troposphere and the stratosphere are this sort of onion skin that sits on the top of the planet. And I mean, to put it in context, how sort of shrinkingly small this space is that if you drove your car at national speed limit vertically upwards, it would take you about 5 minutes to leave the atmosphere. So we've got this really small space that we occupy, and yet into that we're pumping tens of millions of tons of carbon dioxide and other man-made greenhouse gases every day. And so it's having the consequence of disrupting the environment we're in. If you have a look at the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, it's actually a really small, minor part, but the amount that we're contributing is having a disruptive effect on that. And of course, you know the science of this, the impact of greenhouse gases, that it prevents some of the heat that comes to us from the sun from escaping the planet. And so it's having this consequent effect of warming the planet up. And of course, the sources of those things, well, you might know some of the obvious sources of these things, where things like industrial production or coal plants, but there are some that you might not know. So the thawing permafrost, I'm going to give you an indication of that later on. I'm going to show you the contribution of landfills. You can just see that the landfills down the side. It sort of it has the impact of landfills have a multiple impact, and you're going to see directly how big a contribution it plays actually later on. But the biggest contribution is burning of fossil fuels, and that's the thing in particular we need to focus our attention on. As I'm going to go through this, I'm going to give you really one take that's the importance of 1.5 degrees. And I just wanted to illustrate why that is so important. One of the things that we do when we look at the model that we're currently at, this is a McKinsey chart, but what they did here is they took where we currently are and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we're putting out. And then they looked at a number of things. So firstly, they looked at if we continued our upward trend, population is anticipated to grow by 2050, is anticipated to grow from around 7 billion now to maybe as much as 11 billion, certainly probably at least around 9.5 billion. So if we just continue that trend, then we're going to see maybe temperatures by the end of the century will have grown by about 60 degrees. And obviously that will have a significant impact on the world that we live. But there's also a couple of other projected situations. First one is that we're already doing a whole lot, and I'll talk about it, about renewable energies. If we continued that trend, we could probably get to around 3.5 degrees increase. And then there's the final scenario, which is if we start managing our carbon output now, can we get and manage the temperature increase to about 1.5 degrees? To put it in context, the current temperature is around 0.95 of a degree higher than the historical average. So we're already some significant way towards that 1.5 degrees. And the reason why people are especially worried about it is they feel unless we start managing these things, there could be a runaway effect. And I'm going to talk about some of the runaway effects later on. But as more Arctic and Antarctic ice melts, water levels will go up and temperatures will go up. Or as more permafrost melts, we will find that there's going to be more carbon and greenhouse gases reduced. So one of the things we talk about is this idea that there's 12 years of budget left from when this research first came out a couple of years ago. 12 years of budget left, and as we've passed the first couple of years of that, we've been more than burning our allocation. So we know that we need to do something probably in the next 7 to 10 years to get this back on track. It's why it's got a degree of urgency. These are the runaway effects that I've mentioned. These include things like loss of ice or forests burning, or you can see just down there on the bottom left, the release of methane. I'm going to show you this a little bit later on, but this is as permafrosts are melting in the Arctic and the Antarctic, these whole loads of greenhouse gases that are just frozen under the ground. And you can see there, this is like a reverse crater where a huge bubble of methane has exploded out of the ground. And you can see on the other side, one of the other things that might run out of control is the change of ocean patterns. So we're starting to witness more and more. Where we currently are is that 19 of the hottest 20 years in history have happened in the last 20 years. And the last 5 years have seen the 5 hottest years in history. 2020 is not there yet because we don't yet know if 2020 is going to be we've not completed it, but there's 70% likelihood that 2020 will be the hottest year on history. And it's worth putting into context. You might have heard of El Nino, the El Nino effect. This year we've had the opposite, which is in the southern hemisphere, something called the La Nina effect. It generally cools the planet down slightly. And so even despite that, we're still on track to have the hottest year in history. So just an indication, some of the ways that we've seen the hottest year in history in Death Valley, we've seen it in Kuwait, we've seen it in the Middle East, in Africa. You might even remember at the start of the year, we witnessed the hottest year in Australia, hottest day of the year ever in Australia. So that was around the time that we were witnessing the forest fires there. So we're just seeing hot and hotter temperatures. I think it's an indication that we're moving really beyond where we anticipated. One of the things also to be aware of is that the vast majority of extra heat that we trap into the earth is being trapped in the oceans. About 93% of that extra heat is trapped in the oceans, and that's having the impact of creating more wet events. So these are sort of global record-breaking rainfall events, and we're witnessing more and more of these. This was just back at the start of this year. We witnessed the weather bomb. You might remember that. When we were thinking that that was as bad as the year could get, that was those 3 big storms that happened at once, and we saw big flooding. This photograph here is in Gloucestershire, but anyone who's lived anywhere near York will know that the River Ouse frequently floods, but this was the record flood for the River Ouse. So we're witnessing these flooding events not only globally, but we're witnessing them closer to home as well. I pulled this off the Met Office website and just gives you an illustration of how this happens. Quite often we might casually say, well, you know, British temperatures are up 1 degree, and it's projected that they could grow by another 3 or 4 degrees. Is that so bad? And here's where we start seeing some of the consequences. February was more than twice as wet as normal, and May was off the charts. I think it was about as fifth as wet as normal. So we're just having these extremes, extreme heat and extreme wetness. And if nothing else, that's having a big impact on agriculture and farming. Across the US, we're starting to see more and more land that is no longer able to be farmed, but we're witnessing that closer to home as well. So this was in Poland this year. Poland and the Czech Republic both saw record droughts for 500 years, and we're witnessing in some countries that this is just becoming a norm, that land is being rendered unusable. This guy, I think, gives us a pointer of what will happen. So over the last 15 years in Syria, they've witnessed a massive amount of their previously fertile land has become unable to grow. And so this guy here had 400 acres of wheat, and now it's all desert. And what we witnessed is that I mentioned that land has become unfertile. What first happened in Syria was that land becoming unfertile freed up about 1.5 million people, left the land and went to cities. And then, of course, what happened is that war hit cities like Damascus and Aleppo, and those people found themselves fleeing and coming to Europe. So this gives you a pointer of one of the biggest consequences. Sometimes when we say, well, look, you know, this won't necessarily affect us, we forget the impact of climate migration. And I'm going to come and talk about that in a second. The other thing I mentioned that starts to get out of control, this runaway effect, is the impact of fires. And this is, obviously, we witnessed the California fires a couple of months ago. We started the year with those hideous scenes in Australia, and really the sort of the decimation that these fires are causing. But again, this is happening close to home as well. So in 2019, there was a record number of wildfires in the UK. We don't yet have a 2020 figure, largely because the organisation that used to collect the number of wildfires in the UK was European, and so we no longer give the data to it. But at the middle of the year, we'd already exceeded the 2019 numbers. We were trending upwards. It's just an indication that these things, while they're principally global phenomena, they really do exist on our doorstep as well. I mentioned one of those other runaway effects was the decline of ice, and we're really starting to witness an acceleration of this. So this gives you an indication of across the whole of Greenland, massive fall in the amount of ice. But just if we look into the specific examples, we're seeing these trends are sort of off the charts. They're falling precipitously. And so you end up with these really sort of alarming situations where this is in Siberia, where this year they recorded like heat wave temperatures. They recorded 30 degrees Celsius in Siberia, and that had the impact actually of just reducing these pockets of methane. So this weird sort of happening here is effectively a farmer in Siberia is out and has discovered a whole pocket of methane just sitting under the ground. And I think along the way, we've had something like 7,000 of these discoveries. That one there, someone's just kicks into it and releases it. obviously you saw the photograph right at the outset where we had those pockets of methane, and effectively they were just exploding. So the reason why that has a multiple impact is that firstly, methane as a greenhouse gas is several times more potent than carbon dioxide, but also as we're releasing these pockets of gas, the Arctic and the Antarctic used to be basically net reducers of greenhouse gases, and now they're net creators. So puts us in a situation where that runaway, that snowball effect is taking hold, and we're witnessing this more and more scenes of ice melting. This was a location where someone used to have their dogs pulling their sled across ice. Now effectively this summer it was a lake. Record temperatures in Antarctic as well. So we're seeing this trending upwards. One of the ways that someone described this to me is they said the Earth acts a bit like an engine. By design, it's meant to take heat from hot places and move it to cold places, and that's what we have here. So we have, every time that the temperature might go up by a degree here, it goes up by 3 degrees in the poles. So that's why we're seeing more and more effectively ice melting in those places, and all of these contribute to this. One of the big consequences of greenhouse of global warming that we're worried about, seawater levels rising. In Miami, they're in a situation where they're seeing storm surges bringing water levels to higher and higher levels, and the consequence of that is, firstly, they're debating building a 13-foot high city wall to try and protect them. Miami's very similar to Amsterdam in the sense that it's got a lot of reclaimed land from the sea. A lot of what used to be sort of swampland, really, sort of seawater filled swampland, is reclaimed, and so it's very close to the ocean level, and stands the prospect in storms of being incredibly damaged. But we're also witnessing that not only in sort of rich cities like Miami, but we're also witnessing this across Bangladesh, across Southeast Asia. We're witnessing agricultural land being flooded with seawater and it actually being rendered unusable. So salination in Bangladesh has made a lot of agricultural land no longer able to grow. And these are the things in aggregate. So I gave you a hint of this earlier. One of the things that we saw with Syrian refugees is that even if we didn't believe it impacted us, it starts having an impact on our politics, and it starts having an impact on the way that we live our society. And as we project forwards, these things are likely to get considerably worse. The number of uninhabitable zones in the world used to be sort of these effectively a swathe of Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa, but if you look forward and project forward, by 2070 it's anticipated that uninhabitable zones will extend across Latin America. They'll be across sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and Northern Australia, so where the temperatures are just too high and the land is no longer able to be cultivated. And those things in aggregate show, I think, one of the biggest and most ignored impacts of climate change. It's estimated that the world will see by the end of the century about 1 billion climate refugees. When we look into the story of these people are principally moving because they are unable to eat. So famine is driving these people starting to move. And if you might remember, 4 years ago, almost exactly, Donald Trump was talking a lot about building a wall. Principally, the people who are migrating and migrating into the US aren't coming specifically from Mexico, they're coming through Mexico, and it's because in places like in Latin America, they're finding that there's a big shortage of food, partly political, partly climatic, but principally it's an indication of what's to come. Sort of, so if any of us sit there thinking this won't come to us, I think it's an important reminder. So must we change? Absolutely, resolutely. It's almost it's unarguable that unless we change, these things are going to have a much bigger impact than we can imagine. So that was like the doom-laden part of it. I think, giving us an indication of what we need to do. Now I want to give you something a little bit more optimistic. Can we change? I'm going to take you into some of the evidence for that. So firstly, I mentioned that the biggest contributor to greenhouse gases is the burning of fossil fuels. So I want to just take you into why there's really very strong reasons to be optimistic on solar power and on wind power. They've way exceeded what any of us might have imagined, even 3 or 4 years ago. In fact, last week there was a big report by the IEA, the International Energy Authority, and they said that even since they made their estimates 2 years ago, solar, that I'm going to come on to, has exceeded their optimistic estimates by 50%. So we're in this extraordinary situation. Firstly, wind, there's no shortage of wind. Wind could power the earth 40 times over. So we know that we've got the assets to use wind. And it's where Britain is particularly benefiting. When we did the projections back to when it was Bush versus Gore for the American presidential election, we estimated that by 2010, there would be about 30 gigawatts of electricity power. To put that in context, actually the UK will produce 30 gigawatts this year. So we've just way exceeded the estimations we made. And in fact, by 2019, we'd exceeded it 22-fold. So we've moved very strongly in the right direction. And there were a couple of really lovely headlines this year because of this. So first one is that Britain went sort of in early lockdown. Britain went 2 months with using no fossil fuel power. So we just were using wind. First time in over 150 years, 140 years since the Industrial Revolution. Really inspiring. We used fossil power briefly then because the wind dipped. This is a photograph here of onshore wind. Obviously, the majority of the wind that we use in the UK is this offshore wind, and we went another 55 days after that. So it dipped briefly. Then, even in the height of the summer, we were getting really strong wind power being created. Now, obviously, we're in a sort of lovely situation of being able to do that, but the numbers are extraordinary and off the charts. What we've discovered is just our capacity to grow wind energy has been incredibly cheap and incredibly abundant. And so you might have seen as a consequence, this headline that came out a couple of weeks ago. The Prime Minister addressed the Conservative Party conference, and he said that by 2030, his ambition was that every time you turned on the plug at home, it would be powered by wind. And superficially, that sounds really interesting, sounds inspiring. I just want to give you a couple of pointers on interpreting that. Because firstly, domestic power use, home power use, is about a third of all of our power in the UK. It doesn't include cars, it doesn't include industry. And so it represents about 30%. Now, it also represents, if we set about using all of that, it's about 40 gigawatts. It represents a significant slowdown from the chart and the growth that we've already been showing. So it's worth putting in context. Wind power, especially onshore wind power, is incredibly cheap. And we find ourselves in a situation now where we're trending significantly higher than the Prime Minister's ambition. And for me, it's a great tragedy. It's like, if there's one thing we could set about doing, is setting ourselves a goal that is ambitious, inspiring, maybe set about delivering all of our power by wind by 10 years' time. Certainly other countries are setting about having that ambition. And I think that's probably where we need to be if we're going to try and be carbon neutral far sooner. So just a good reminder, sounds like a great headline. In fact, it represents really sort of a decline in our ambition. And to put it into context, the UK still provides 10 billion in subsidies every year to the fossil fuel industry, largely to subsidise offshore oil rigs. So, you know, the question might be, well, if we put that money into wind power, which is cheaper, could we effectively accelerate our growth? Next one I want to come on to solar. Important thing about solar, as I said, if wind could power the earth 40 times over, there's enough solar energy in an hour to power the earth for a year. So we're going to never run out of these power sources. And last week, the International Energy Authority that I mentioned, they came out of a report saying that solar power is the cheapest energy in history. So we're in this extraordinary moment in solar power that it's way exceeded everyone's expectations. We estimated around the millennium that there would be about a gigawatt of extra solar power every year. In fact, we way exceeded that by 17-fold by 2010. And actually by last year, we'd exceeded it by 120-fold. So solar effectively has got something close to, if you've ever heard of Moore's law. So Moore's law in computing is where effectively every 18 months, computer processors double in capacity, double in power. What we're witnessing in solar is that every time you double the amount of money you put into it, the effectiveness of it doubles as well. So we're seeing this incredible growth where, as the installations are going up, so too the cost is coming down. So to look at those costs there, in fact, we're finding that we're seeing a cost of 20 cents per watt. In fact, we're way exceeding that right now. So 20 cents per watt is the average, but some of the solar plants that are coming on board, 2 that were commissioned this year, one in the United Arab Emirates, so incredibly hot space, but it's coming on at 1.3 cents per kilowatt and per kilowatt hour, and then same in Portugal. So these really nice tropical and warm climates producing incredibly cheap power. And I think, the interesting thing for us is how science is confounding some of our expectations. So I love this story, which is Northern Australia. You might remember it was increasingly believed that Northern Australia is going to be inhospitable. It's going to be too hot. But Northern Australia has just signed this deal to provide solar power to Singapore. How? It's a massive difference between gap between Northern Australia and Singapore, how they're going to lay a cable under the ocean. And to put it in context, how incredibly ambitious that is, the distance between Northern Australia and Singapore is about the distance between Dorset and Morocco. So it just gives you this incredible perspective that we're just doing things that I think even 2 or 3 years ago, people would have regarded as lunacy. We're actually starting to create these complete transformations in the way we're using some of this energy. As a result of this, the head of strategy at BP says that they can anticipate that some of their reserves won't be dug up. And I think, when you see the United Arab Emirates are getting into solar power and they recognize it's cheaper, we start reaching a situation where there's questions about whether we're even going to access all of the fossil fuel reserves in the ground. What we're witnessing is, even in countries that don't believe in climate change, Poland has a populist government that doesn't believe in climate change, but this year they've made huge investments into solar and into wind power. Why? Because it's really, really cheap. So I think we're winning the economic argument as well as the political one. I just wanted to take a second to to talk through this chart, really, because one of the things that we often find ourselves thinking is, well, what can we do on climate change? And so these are the top 10 things that anyone's done. One of the most comprehensive reports into climate change was published in this book. It's a book called Drawdown, and it's sort of about 500 scientists contributed to it, trying to work out what we could do to solve global warming, climate disruption. And these are the top 10 biggest things. And the reason why I show it is that I think it illustrates that the solution to this is holistic, and actually it takes a degree of extra imagination. So, what you're definitely going to see on this list is, absolutely things like renewable energy. Onshore wind is number 2. Rooftop solar is number 10. Solar farms is number 8. So there's loads of stuff we can do about accelerating the amount of renewable energies, but there's a lot of other things on there that you might not have considered. So let me show you a couple of them. I'll call out the whole list. But number 6, number 7, educating girls and family planning. So to put this in context, I mentioned at the outset, the world population by 2050 is estimated to be around 9.7 billion. But in fact, that's based on us educating girls and improving family planning. So to give you a perspective, sometimes we neglect only the education of boys and girls isn't the same internationally. And what we know is that in Southeast Asia, around half of all girls are educated. In sub-Saharan Africa, while 3/4 of girls start education, only 7% of girls finish it. And here's the difference. Girls who complete 12 years of schooling, on average, have 5 children fewer. So what we know is that as we're projecting to 2050, one of the, of course, the morally right things to do is to extend education so it's equal across both sexes. But what we discover is that actually by doing that, it has a really powerful impact on helping us to reduce the impact of climate change. Now, one of the other ways that we can do that is family planning, and that's the approach that's been taken in Bangladesh. Average family size has gone from 6 children to 2 children in the last 10 years by education, by educating families that actually children don't necessarily have to be their insurance policy to survive a cruel life, but actually if they reduce the number of children they have with child mortality going down, reducing the number of children they have, it actually improves their standard of living. So we've seen that in Bangladesh, we've seen that in Iran. Iran has reduced its population growth by 50% in the last 20 years by the same family planning approach. So you wouldn't necessarily expect family planning and educating girls to have such an impact, but really is one of the biggest things that any of us can do. A few others here. You know, you see down there, reduced food waste, number 3. Reduced food waste is number 3. Why? Because it's sort of this win-win. If we reduce the amount of food we waste, firstly, we save on the fuel miles that are created to distribute that food to us. And secondly, food that isn't consumed goes into landfill and produces methane. And methane, I mentioned before, is like this many times over greenhouse gas. So the more that we can produce those things, reduce those things, effectively it reduces climate impact. There's a few others I'll show you here. Silvopasture is where we add a few trees to the land that cows graze on. Either we border the fields with trees, which increases the carbon takedown of those locations tenfold, or we put a few trees in the middle of pasture, and that helps us draw down more land. So you see that makes it to the top 10. And the final one I'll talk about there is number 1, which is refrigeration. A few of us are old enough to remember the ozone layer and how the aerosols and the refrigerators that we were using were damaging the ozone layer. And we swapped out CFCs, you might remember them, CFCs were they were propellants. We swapped them for HCFCs. And the unexpected consequence of that is that HCFCs are 6,000 times worse as greenhouse gases than CO2. So what we know is that as air conditioning is becoming a norm in a lot of the places around the world, the refrigerants that are inside air conditioning units and refrigerators are incredibly toxic for the environment if we let them go. And so just getting a system in place where every country around the world, we capture those gases as those units are put out of use, seems to be one of the most effective things we can do. So as any of us are sitting there thinking, what could we do? I think just that top 10 for me is mind-blowing. Final thing I'll show you is, will we change? Well, you might know this in 2 weeks' time, when the day after the US presidential election is the day that the US can choose to leave the Paris Climate Agreement. Every other country in the world is part of it. The US has chosen to leave, and they can't withdraw till the day after the election. If the current president retains the election, then he is committed to withdraw them. If there's a change of president, Vice President Biden, the Democratic candidate, has mentioned that he will recommit them to it. So, you know, can we move in that direction? Even if the US isn't part of it, places like Canada, China have committed to being carbon neutral by 2060. Massive endeavor that is, and it's just an indication that there is a strong political will to move us in the right direction. And I think the cheapness of some of the fuels is helping, but other people are just taking to the streets, and I think we're seeing more and more this is becoming a popular movement. The reason why I wanted to get involved is it feels like we don't necessarily have a lot of leadership in terms of public figures. It's why it's so delightful that David Attenborough has taken a lead. It's why it's so delightful that we're seeing people like Greta Thunberg getting attention, because it feels, I think in hindsight, we'll look back and reflect how little leadership there is in this space. We are seeing some, though. So more and more countries, last couple of charts now, more and more countries are talking about when they're going to phase out their own fossil fuel powered cars. Britain has said 2040, but we're starting to see that already, even though there's that context, we're moving forward. So the Mayor of Paris has said really interesting character. She said that you're not going to be able to drive diesel powered vehicles into Paris, not allowed to drive them in 4 years time, and you're not going to be allowed to drive cars that are powered by fossil fuels in 10 years time. And I suspect we're going to start seeing an acceleration of that. People, as they move to their next car, will start thinking, I wonder if I should switch to something that's going to be battery powered rather than motor engine powered. So great. I warned you it was an assault on the senses. I warned you it was sort of quite intense experience. I've tried to sort of give you a perspective on that. For me, I'm really inspired by how we're evolving and we're developing these things. I think the movement into renewable power is obviously probably the biggest godsend for us. As we're running out of time, we are in this situation where we actually really do have solutions available to us. So I think Sally mentioned we're going to take some questions either in the chat bar, or if people want to sort of jump in and shout them out, I'm very willing to take them either way.
Thank you, Bruce. We haven't actually had any questions because I think the assault on the senses means that everyone's been by all those numbers and facts. But I have to say that wind and solar stuff is incredible. The rise in the use of that. I had no idea.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just an indication, really. And I think that's it. A lot of people don't have an indication. So as a consequence, when we hear the Prime Minister saying we're going to power every household by wind, it seems like, fantastic, how magical, we're moving in the right direction. But in fact, we're sort of on a trajectory to way exceed that. And I think it's look, the reason why wind and solar have become so rapidly adopted is because they're incredibly cheap. I mentioned, on the list of top 10 things, onshore wind is by far the cheapest. Politically, I think a lot of us sort of feel reluctant to pollute our skylines with wind turbines. And I know they've become incredibly popular in the Scottish Highlands, in sort of distant places in Scotland. Scotland powers all of its power with wind power, but it's just a question of whether we're willing to accept it elsewhere, really. But if not, then offshore is proving incredibly successful. If you ever find yourself flying to Holland, or if you ever find yourself on the Liverpool coast, you'll see huge wind farms just off the shore as you fly over.
Okay, so we've got a few things popping into the chat here. A couple of questions. So Mike, who works for my NHS Trust, asking if there's any value in our trust or other kind of organisations, public organisations like ours, kind of declaring a climate emergency, if you like. I mean, Patrick might be able to talk a little bit in a minute. I know that our local councils have declared climate emergencies and therefore a commitment to do something about that for themselves as well. I don't know what you know about other organisations and how they've kind of committed to that.
Yeah, it's a really worthwhile endeavour, because one of the things that comes from that is that we often start thinking about how we can measure our own impact. And, a lot of people this year have reduced the amount of travel they do. And obviously that's had an impact of moving us slightly closer to where we need to be to hit our 1.5 degree commitments. But the more that we can all collectively declare those things, what it forces us to do, it encourages us to start measuring what we're doing and having our own impact. And of course, the first thing that happens is if a trust like yourselves declares that, then your energy suppliers firstly are given a strong warning that increasingly you don't want fossil fuel created power. The great thing we're finding with a lot of the renewals, and there's a question in the notes, is that what we're finding is that it's often proving cheaper in a lot of places to build these new plants, so that even if you account for the construction to build these new plants, it's still proving cheaper than running our old carbon burning plants. So we're in this incredible situation. Vice President Biden, the Democratic candidate, often talks about, actually, anytime someone talks to him about green politics, he sees jobs. And that's definitely the case. We can find ourselves in a situation where we're building more of these offshore power plants. The teams that are required to maintain them, these are brand new and zero carbon jobs. So it's proving incredibly productive and profitable to do it. You know, the reason why we're moving so quickly to wind power is that it's really cheap. So absolutely, you know, if you declare your own climate emergency, or you declare, you know, your own thing, it just gives all of your suppliers a sense that they need to take this seriously as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that we have just approved our green strategy as part of our strategic framework. So it's absolutely woven into everything we do. And hopefully some of the other organisations as well. That's from an organisational point of view. Georgia is asking, how easy is it for us to switch our domestic fuel supplies to renewable sources? So there's the bit about organisationally, what can we do? And then what can we individually do as well? And I don't know how easy that is to do.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, what can we do individually? I think that top 10 list gives you an indication. So, you know, someone mentioned in the note, I gave up eating beef and lamb a few years ago. Exactly that. So, you know, if you do eat red meat and you want to carry on eating red meat, then maybe just switching out red meat a couple of times. Red meat is about 50 times worse in terms of the amount of greenhouse production it creates than chicken, for example. So and you know, switching to something as a meat substitute, or the as someone who doesn't eat meat, let me tell you that the shift this year, the meat substitute burgers, the Beyond Meat ones that Tesco sell, or I think you can get them elsewhere as well, are unbelievable. So even if you say to yourself, right, I'm just going to switch 1 or 2 meals a week into that, actually see if the family notice. You know, that's a great thing to do. So that's one of the things we can do. Moving our own energy suppliers and moving our own contribution away from fossil fuel can help as well. So I think, you know, the actions that we can personally take work in 2 ways. Firstly, they act to reduce our own contribution, but also they give signals to people around us, and they give everyone that this is something that we can all do. I mentioned there in the top 10 list, rooftop solar is one of the things that some people are looking at. And if you've got space where you could have a couple of solar panels, they generally, a couple of panels will generate about £500 to £1,000 worth of electricity a year. So definitely, if you are in a situation that you've got space on your roof or at the bottom of your garden, you might want to consider that as well.
Okay, so we haven't got any more questions in there now. So I think what I'll do is I'll hand over to Patrick, who is our sustainability lead for Dorset Healthcare, and might know a little bit more about what we're doing sort of system-wide, just to wrap it up, really.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sally. Yeah, just to say that as an organisation, we are literally, as I speak, installing solar PV at 3 of our sites, and that is going to be generating around about 350, 400 kilowatts of power, which will certainly be all probably 95, 98% used by those particular sites. We're looking at extending that to other sites. The thing with the funding is it's a little bit perverse that a lot of the funding that we can access has this horrible thing, this payback thing, and solar PV in that respect can sometimes be discriminated against because of the amount of payback time for us to access funding. So we have to look at other ways that we can grab money to do that, but it's certainly a great thing to do. And you know, I have solar myself, and it's brilliant. In terms of the energy that we buy it through a procurement through Crown Commercial Services. That they cannot make enough renewable for us to purchase at the moment, so we're being sort of stymied through that. And NHS Improvement are talking to the Crown Commercial Services about expanding the availability of renewables that we can access. We all want to purchase renewable. It's just something that we should be doing, but as an organisation, it can be a struggle. And of course, we have to recognise that it may cost us more to actually buy the renewables, certainly in the beginning. In terms of task force, that was mentioned earlier on, the Trust are, now that the green strategy, which is our green plan, has been, by the sounds of it, ratified by the board, which is great news. We're going to be having a green forum, a green group, call it what we will, which will be grabbing the people from the Trust the people that are really passionate and committed and want to make a difference to come on board, and we're going to do stuff. We're going to do some amazing stuff. So that's going to be about to happen. This is the year to sort of grab the opportunities. Bruce, it's been an absolutely amazing, thought-provoking discussion. We're going to carry on talking about this, but I'm just taken back to the time when it all started and that young girl was walking down that beach and there were thousands of starfish washed up during that really terrible storm. And she started chucking the starfish back in the sea, and people were watching her with amusement. What is she doing? And after a while, that chap approached that little girl and said, why are you putting them back in the sea? You can't save all the starfish. You can't begin to make a difference. And the girl that was crushed and defeated looked and said, I can. I'm going to make a difference, and started throwing all the starfish back in the sea and said to the man, I made a difference to that one. And the old man looked at the girl inquisitively and thought what she'd done, and he was inspired and he joined in. And then he started throwing the starfish back in the sea, and all the onlookers started throwing the starfish back in the sea. And we can all make a difference, whether it be big or small. So thank you very much for joining us today. Take the inspiration, take the passion, let's harness it. Let's use that positive energy. Thank you so much, everybody.